Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Got a lot of material that I'm behind on getting out video wise. I know a lot of you have been asking about updates on the GR Research and Extreme project, and you're probably wondering what the status is as well as why they are up here. A couple of quick updates. I'll do a formal update in a future video with more details and some tips, but I'm basically going to have to assemble these up in the room because once they're assembled, they're going to be too big to go through my winding stairwell up to here, or at least it's going to run a higher risk of problems. So I'm just going to glue them and assemble them up here. The drivers are on the ocean. It's probably going to be another 2 months though, thinking it through what I've seen on similar type shipments from China. So I'll be getting back on that, but I'm going to show you at least I'm still doing the project, and I'm actually going to assemble these and have an update soon. Also, you'll probably notice I threw the Maggie 1.7s into my main setup here, front channels. I'll talk about that in a minute because today's video is going to be talking about tweaks that put a button on that Oh Dear track that I did at 3MA, showcasing different types of speakers, and also it's going to tie into some tweaks that I tell you about today. I also have, you can probably see them here, the tweeter fuse on the Maggies. I replaced that with a bar. I'm going to give you some information on how well that works and my recommendation there. So let me set up the camera, get in front of the camera, and do a little show and tell and talk a little bit more in detail. Okay guys, I just realized I'm even further behind than I thought on videos. I've got stuff from Stephanie, new equipment that arrived at 3MA, some 3MA customers home video that I think you're going to find cool. So yeah, I'm really backed up in content. So I want to put a bow on the video I did with the Oh Dear demo, give some context to what I heard, as well as kind of parlay it into some tips and tweaks and accessories to finish up kind of that video series for now, and what tips, tweaks, and accessories I recommend, because the two kind of go hand in hand when I start explaining the different types of speakers that we heard at 3MA playing that same song, and what type of tweaks may work with some and not so much with others, and the applicability and what you could expect. So let's dive into the 3MA auditions of the different rooms and different speakers of that track Oh Dear from Sophie Zelmani. Again, all of them, if you heard, were very high level, elite level speakers that we heard, but you probably could even tell through the camera phone mic different presentations from those different speakers. Obviously different rooms too, but I think you could get an impression of how much, at least somewhat, is due to the speaker. And we mainly had two different varieties, box speakers, two of which had ports. The YG had sealed box, but then they had a subwoofer, the Carbon Special by Rel, which just has a passive radiator, a form of a port in a way. Then upstairs we had omnidirectional MBLs with the 4-stack of Rels. And then we also had the MBLs with their own stack of subwoofers. And obviously when you do the delta between MBLs and the box speakers, there's a huge difference, and you just have to audition it. The camera phone mic may even make sometimes a point source speaker that kind of, for lack of a better word, shouts the music at you, can be a positive and a negative. Some people think it's a positive, and on a mic it tends to capture more dynamics. It makes the video impression sound more vivid and detailed. When live, it's kind of a different story. An omnidirectional may not excite the mic in the same way, but when you're there and you feel it and you can sense things that you can't capture in the mic, that's very important. So don't make too much conclusions one way or the other, especially with omnidirectional speakers via a camera phone mic. You have to demo a speaker like the MELs, and like I said, those are kind of my favorites. But if you're kind of in between, you kind of like the MBL, but maybe it's too drastic from what you're used to from point source box speakers, you know, the in between that I'm going to showcase today is that I showed you earlier with the Magnepans that are open baffle. And so they give a little bit of the presentation, the radiation pattern back and forward is almost identical, much like a MBL, but they do have more of a defined center image and stereo pinpointing that a lot of people like with the box speakers. And the other advantage of Magnepans, especially these models, is that it's all one driver for all the frequencies. So it's super coherent. You don't hear tweeter, mid-range, and drivers, a bunch of drivers shouting at you and trying to mix properly with a crossover. There is a crossover in there, but it's basically the same driver material. So there is a level of coherency that's really good with Magnepans. And so you ask, well, why? That seems like the perfect solution. Why doesn't everybody do Magnepans? Why doesn't everybody buy those? Well, quite a few people do buy them, and it's been around for a long time. And I even bought it because there are some huge advantages to that presentation. And for a cost, for those people that can't afford MBLs, this is another option. And so, yes, there are some advantages, but there are significant disadvantages to Maggies too. Because they're using one type of driver for everything, the issues are at the extremes. You really can't play Maggies super loud. If you're below 85 dB or so in most small rooms, you're fine with them. But you start to stress them and play them loud in a big room, that driver material is not meant, and their crossover isn't really designed to handle it properly, and it can sound stressed. On the flip side, at the base level, we're talking about these driver material, the excursion and stuff, just can't move the air like big bass drivers can. So you don't get the visceral impact and bass that you hear from other speakers. So there are trade-offs to Maggies. Now, when you add a REL 25 sub like I did, that can mitigate a huge portion of it. When you can also use DSP and other things. The thing about Maggies is I have seen people try to modify Maggies, and they do measurements on them as if, 1 foot away measurements. I wouldn't do any of those modifications unless whatever those measurements that the people did the mods on are the same at your listening position. You need to really measure Maggies because they interact with the room so much differently than regular speakers. What your in-room measurements are at your listening position. And if you have the same problem, like sometimes they'll show their Maggies roll off or have no highs or something. I don't have that problem at my listening position when I do measurements. So if you do a modification that accentuates the highs, because that's how it tests anechoically, but at your listening position it's fine, you're going to end up actually with a worse speaker, although technically it's better for an anechoic chamber, but it's going to be worse for your listening position. So before you invest in mods for any speaker, actually, make sure that the measurements at your listening position equal whatever the mods are designed to fix inherently wrong with the speaker for anechoic purposes. It's a big tip that a lot of people leave out. So with mine, I can use DSP REL 25, and I'm going to place that same track at a volume that's reasonable. And I think you'll hear very high performance level from that song at a modest cost, and something that you may want to consider if you're, wanting to audition different speakers. But then I've got another speaker that just arrived at 3MA called the Techniques SBR1, I think is what it's called. This is a phenomenal speaker, and in many respects, in my mind, is better than all of those other box speakers that we listen to. Just phenomenal full range performance, a coaxial mid-range and tweeter that really was impressive. We were fixated today listening to that. So I'm going to add tracks of Oh Dear by Sophie Zelmani on that one. And let me just tell you, that's a speaker you need to audition if you're in that over 20,000 ballpark up to whatever. It's a very impressive speaker. If you can afford it, it's just, trust me, you're gonna want to hear that one. But it goes back to the tips and tweaks, though. What can you do to address different issues for different types of speakers? With most floor standing speakers, they have ported bass. And the reason I chose that track that I did is because ported bass really isn't a huge problem with most music, rock music, synthesized bass. People don't really put a lot of stock into the quality of bass with that type of music because you don't even really have a benchmark of what to gauge it to anyway. Whether it's a little bit slow or tubby, it doesn't really matter because the music isn't really demanding that accuracy as imperative for the enjoyment. It's really providing that for visceral impact more than precise tones. So, but with acoustic music and guitars, standing basses, things that in real life, voices that may go low, that's where ported bass can sometimes muddy the sound, sometimes get that port chuffing noise that gets added and slows down the performance and doesn't give as tight a bass as what would be in real life, that same instrument. And to these designers' credit, Burmester, Eggleston, and also the techniques that I'm going to showcase, they did a phenomenal job with the port noise not really being a problem. But when I came back and listened to my speakers that were in the main listening position, these older ones, these sound lines, I had a box at the bottom with the bass driver that's ported, but usually I have it sealed with one of my tips and tweaks, which is one of these just styrofoam cones that can easily fit in no matter what size your port. These are good to use to plug it, and you don't have to worry about sizing it properly. But I played that song when I came back just to benchmark what my system sounded like compared to the other ones, and I was like, man, something doesn't sound right. I got my REL 25 sub on. Is everything working right? What went wrong? And then I realized I had pulled out the ports from those boxes, from the bass box of there when I was doing my tweak video, and I didn't put them back in. And so it was immediately noticeable, the port noise on that speaker and how much impact it had with that sound. And those other speakers did have a little bit of the port noise issue. Eggleston, to their credit, did a really small port, and they put it in the corner back of the speaker. So I don't know intentionally if that's designed to help with the disruption of the airflow to cause less port noise or whatever. And then the Burmester uses 2 ports on the back, 2 much bigger ports in total to kind of mitigate the port noise. But both did a great job. The YG has a sealed box, but it's a little more limited in its extension, and that's why it's got a REL carbon 25 carbon special back there. So sticking with the ports, this is a tip and tweak that can potentially have a great improvement in your sound. Now, be warned, it may not always have a great improvement, and it might even make things worse because some boxes, when you seal them, you may increase the pressure inside of them and create a resonance that previously you didn't have. Then that could cause a problem. And some bass drivers aren't designed to be in a sealed box, and so they might not perform as well if you seal the port. So this is one of those tips and tweaks, accessories that I put, if you watch my video again, in tier 3. Potentially good impact, but try and see first. Another thing that I wanted to talk about with the Maggies, the tips and tweaks, is DSP for your listening position, as well as things like vibration control, because Maggies don't have a cabinet construction like Rockports, okay? So it does have a little bit more of a resonance, and I'm sure on a measurement it'll show ringing and different issues at different frequencies because there's just the firmness of the structure is not there, and how it's tethered to the floor very loosely is not really optimal for negating resonances. So there are these things, like I've got the My stands that firm up the structure, but still the coupling to the floor, I've always found, especially with Maggies, it's kind of better to decouple than to couple them with spikes and harder to the ground. Because what I found with the vibration control videos that I did and have confirmed subsequently with listening tests and talking to other people is that really it's all about getting rid of the ringing after the initial impulse response. A speaker is going to get that initial vibration of notes or whatever happens in your room. The initial impulse is hard to dampen totally or with coupling or decoupling. But it's all about getting rid of the ringing afterward. And that is what we saw in the measurements in my videos, is that some impulses can really ring certain materials for a long time. And so with speakers especially, and also turntables, you don't want that energy getting trapped in there and building up ringing, because impulses are constantly happening. So it's not like a foot stomp like I did in my video and then it stops. You're hitting impulse, impulse, impulse. You just want to make sure you mitigate that ringing such that it never just keeps building up to where it causes an audible problem. And I'm doing this in a very primitive manner, but hopefully you're getting the point. So like I talked about in those videos, you know, the squash ball solution, double yellow squash balls with the vibrapods is great for equipment like turntables. I've found with measurements this will mitigate vibrations and the ringing after that initial impulse response. It'll mitigate the impulse response too, the initial one, but the ringing is really where this helps. Same thing with your speakers. And I use the Townsend seismic bars underneath the Maggies to dissipate the ringing, and I had good success with that. By the way, I am going to have another tip, tweak idea that I want to share with you that probably trumps all the other ones in terms of improving the enjoyment of your system. And it's also going to tie into the Sophie Zelmani track that I've played, but that's going to deserve its own video. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to upload for now the tracks of Oh Dear, Sophie Zelmani on the Maggies in my house, as well as the techniques over at 3MA that sounded phenomenal. So pay those a listen and be back here soon because I have plenty more to come.